We have a culture that's built on dishonest engagement, and that was set into motion with a different kind of potency in the era that we're referring to. And leaving that unexamined, I would argue, is a recipe for ultimate disaster.
Welcome to This Strange Land with Jason Jensen. Join the conversation with other courageous ministry leaders as we explore what it means to serve the church in a rapidly changing and unfamiliar world. Discover insight, wisdom, and inspiration as you live out your ministry calling in this strange land.
Today, I'm sitting down with a good friend, Pete White. We've done a few projects together, and I'll get into that in a second, but we've developed a friendship over the course of the last, I'd say, couple years.
One I'm thankful for.
Yeah, me too. And you've been a therapist for close to 2 decades.
Mm-hmm.
Started in forensics, working with inmates, and then had a private practice for 15 years, 16 years. And I know that what you bring to your practice and your therapeutic modality and all of those things is that there's a deep understanding and integration of a philosophical approach, but also an anthropological approach and a love of people and how they work. Mm-hmm. And those 3 things have been integrated in a way that I find extremely fascinating, which is why when we have a project that even remotely touches those areas, you're the person I phone and say, look, I want your mind and your heart on a project.
Right.
I also know that you are a apprentice of Jesus, as the way you put it. Mm-hmm. And so with that, I'm really looking forward to a conversation that we had, especially because we've had a few projects recently where we've been getting into some topics around where we find ourselves today in our modern context, especially as it relates to the person.
Yeah.
So I want to welcome you onto the podcast. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you.
It's a joy to be with you, my friend.
Yeah.
I appreciate all of the encounters that I get to have here with you and with your team, with Kevin and everybody else, and see the environment that you've curated here, and to know personally a little bit about the ebb and flow of finding your lane as an organization, and the deep integrity that you've carried all of that with, both yourself as a leader, but also the whole team. And arriving at a shared vision for work is not as easy as it might seem. And every time I come, there's a synthesis or an integration of purpose among all the people here. And it's oriented to what's good for everybody. And I commend you for that. And we frankly need more of that. And in some of the language that you and I are familiar with inside of a faith tradition writ large, we come from 2 different
Parts of God's kingdom.
Parts of God's kingdom. That's good language. But work like this is a good way to say what's happening, is that it's the kingdom coming on earth as in heaven. And it's occupation submitted to a higher goal and a higher governance, in a sense. And I think that speaks a little bit to some of the things that are missing in our culture, but I know we'll go wherever the Spirit leads today. But I do want to properly acknowledge that in you with gratitude. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a generous response to my introduction.
That's true.
Thank you.
It's just true.
Yeah. And one of the ways that we've gotten to know each other as, spending time fishing together, hope to do more there. But the other way is actually trying to think through how to properly orient ourselves in the culture that we're at. And
not an easy task.
Yeah, not an easy task. And one thing that, as we've been bringing some of this understanding to bear, it's been really good to, it's shaped the way I've thought about it when I hear you articulate from a, psychological, but weaving in some of the philosophical elements too of how we get to a modern man's understanding of the self and how that has been broken and how we get into kind of the place that we are today when you think. And I know through your therapeutic practice, you're actually touching that in real life and helping somebody see sort of a broader picture, both a very macro view and a very micro view at the same time. And I appreciate the integration of those two things as well. And I want to talk about the macro view. And so we've had a conversation before about how did we get here? How did from your perspective, how do we get to this modern understanding of the self as a culture, which you and I would both say is broken?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long journey, and nobody has ultimate authority on. There's a lot of ways to reflect on, what the self is, but then what the ebb and flow of matters has been that sees us arriving at this version of the self. And it is maybe helpful to acknowledge that the current view of the self, and this might be a novel concept for the average Joe or Jane out there, but the current version of the self is a modern artifact. It's not like unto what prior versions of self would have understood about the human condition. And it's a very particular version of the self that we've arrived at that you could argue isn't actually helpful. It doesn't move society along in directions that are good for the whole. That would be an argument that I would make.
Just if we take a step back, what is the self in more of a psychological literature perspective? When we talk about the self, what are we talking about as a term?
Yeah, well, it depends on who you're consulting, right? In the whole corpus of psychology. But I would glimpse the self as first human, right? And then engendered, right? We're male or female. And then we are this individual. And the part that we're talking about when we say the self, we're really looking at the individual aspect of it. And that's certainly what we've become obsessed with in the modern West. And so it's the inner person. It's the individual in their conscious understanding of who they are and why they are in the society that they inhabit. And
what framework they're using to drive themselves forward.
That's right. And we would call that framework, one term that we might use for it is worldview. And it's one of the kind of the modern paradoxes that as long as humans have been humans in the form that we currently exist for all of recorded history, everybody has had a worldview. And at various times throughout history, society has been more or less conscious of the worldview that it holds. And I would say that in my reading of history, worldview and through the psychological emphases that I've lived inside of as a therapist, one of the artifacts of the modern self is how unaware of its worldview that it is, and how disparate the tenets of the modern worldview are, how in competition within the individual they seem to be. And so that's a statement about whether or not the modern self is integrated. You've used the word integrated a few times today. And I don't think it is. I think the modern self, to make a generalized statement, is actually quite fragmented and led asunder by its conflicting wants and interests, and without a presiding narrative over above that self, under which the self can be guided. It's kind of a every man, every woman for themselves sort of deal. And there's a fragmentation in culture that has led to that, right? And of course, you ask the chicken and the egg question: what came first, the interests of the individual producing the society, or the interests of the society that produced this in the individual? And of course, the answer is yes, right, to both.
Right.
But yeah, so if we go back, and you named the Enlightenment, the claim on what counts as knowledge really got turned on its head in that era. And when we used to use the language of knowledge, we would account for more in that term than we now do. We go immediately after the Enlightenment. There's still a unity to what most people hold in their mind as knowledge. And in various circles that got referred to as the unity of truth theory. And people like Julie Rubin have written about this extensively in her book, The Making of the Modern University, for example. And there she traces what happened to knowledge over the last 120, 150 years in the West. And where once we used to hold, this is maybe a quick and dirty way of explaining,
sure,
or typifying a self in that era, let's say the turn of the 20th century into the 1900s. That self is going to hold a view of knowledge that says, inside of the unity of truth theory, 1 + 1 = 2 isn't just objectively true. Okay? It's also inherently good. And those two are in combination with one another, because anytime you're reflecting on the order of things such as they have been established, you are looking at the reflection of the character and the interests and the mind of God in the architecture of the universe. And so that's inherently good because it emanates from God, and it's objectively true when we look at how it's arranged. It's properly ordered. There's an infrastructure and an architecture to it that is discernible. Mm. And so we would quest after knowing that. And when you read a lot of the early scientists in the traditions of science that we have, whether it's Baconian or Newtonian or whichever kind of flavor profile you're reading inside of, you see a reverence there. You read into that story a backdrop of
this truth and goodness are not separated.
They're not separated.
Ideas.
They're unified, and there's a sense of mystery that this scientist has in what they're observing, and there's an accordant humility that accompanies that. And when you set that down beside what has become of our claims on what counts as knowledge, now empiricism has risen through the ranks as the dominant epistemology, and what it has to say, and ironically, this isn't an empirical theory, so empiricism is on its face self-refuting, because nobody put this theory in a test tube and verified that it was so. So it's a claim, and it's actually a religious claim through those.
Or a worldview claim.
Or a worldview claim, right.
It's a faith claim of some
it's
sort.
It's a faith claim, Okay, and that is that we can only have knowledge of the sensate world, that which you can see, taste, touch, right? And that which you can measure and quantify. And we have moved in the direction of a focus on the quantification of everything as our only grounds for how or what to know, right? And what that ends up leaving out of the picture in its entirety is morality, is first principles, is natural law, is the knowledge that you and I would claim that honesty didn't just come into fashion, okay, but it's inherently good and it's a human necessity, and we can know that to be true. Or humility, okay, or generosity, or gratitude, etc.
So in some sense...
So those get relegated into the territory of values, what get called values, and everything else besides gets deemed to be fact.
Right. So you got this moving of goodness and knowledge become almost, by moving it into a value, it becomes a moralistic claim here,
That's
apart from a knowledge claim, which is a separated.
Right.
Moralistic claims aren't made any longer in the knowledge domain.
Right. And so virtue is no longer deemed a necessity. Okay. That's one key feature in the modern West and in the institutions of the modern West. That is a modern distinctive. It's a modern artifact. We've never been there before in this way.
That virtue is not...
It's not
inherent in
the education that people are receiving, because there is a claim that there's no unified. The postmodernist claim is that you can't. Everything is a construction.
Right. So if you think of post-secondary institution is in actually the formation business. Now it moves from formation being, of course, like understanding of something, but also the development of virtue and having a command of yourself, which is where virtue comes in.
Yes.
We move away from that into a bits and bytes transfer.
That's right.
Business in some sense.
That's right. That has no real central guiding principle around which to chart its aims. And so you have all of these different aims that are pursued. And in the quantification of things, it ends up being the kind of modern quest that more is somehow better, without any discernment of either what the more ought to be or how it's better, right? And whether that's boosting quarterly earnings in the corporate setting, or whether that is finding more funding for esoteric research projects that haven't been predicated first on the question, how will this serve the human race? Right? That question
is no longer discerned.
Gets taken more and more out of view inside of the compulsive state that the modern self ends up living in as an atomized self, right? Taken away from the moorings of first principles that society used to be governed by in the West.
So progress is no longer a discerned moral act. It is now a how fast can we go in any certain direction?
Yeah. Well, there are moral claims applied to the modern quest. There's no doubt about that. What you don't tend to see happen is, because if you turn on your Daily Wire, whatever you happen to take in for news and information, you'll hear a spate of moral claims made by every expositor of their purported truth, whatever you happen to be taking in any given moment. But what you won't tend to find is the kind of self-examination that was once required of the individual in order to make a moral claim. The claims are just made, and they're unmoored, right?
Right.
And so it tends to be a fractured and contentious kind of dialogical space, and even the word dialogical doesn't really fit, right? It's more combative, and it's unexamined. And so it tends to operate at a pace that can't serve anybody. There's a frenetic nature to it that produces and almost feeds on anxiety as a kind of surrogate energy source. And we see that reflected in everything from the rates of suicide to the erosion of family systems to the churn in the market space. We have this term, the protean career now, because of the Greek god Proteus that was capable of changing forms. When I last checked the literature on this, it would have been 12 or 15 years ago. And at the time, the average individual in the modern West went through 7 different careers over the course of their lifespan. And a lot of those are disparate. And that can reflect a vocational path.
Sure.
Right? Sometimes it does. And maybe in that case, 7 occupational shifts is a wonderful thing. But what it tends to reflect is an impetuous self moving through life like a human ping pong ball with no real beacon ahead of them as to what is ultimately guiding them or what their real purpose happens to be.
Yeah. And I mean, I saw some research on Gen Alpha, which is roughly 0 to 13 years old.
Yeah.
And
everyone wants to be a YouTuber.
Well, the stat was that most of them would grow, the careers that these kids would have, it was a high number. It was above 50%, don't exist yet. And so that just shows the pace of
what we call development.
Yeah. And so, these people we don't even know what jobs our children
right.
have. So if you think of like what a vocational discernment is, in what I will do for work, like that is almost impossible.
Yeah. It's a remarkable pressure for people.
How did we get, you said unmoored, where did that start? Like how did that happen? And then how did it get so industrialized in, North America or the West specifically?
Yeah. Again, there's a million things to reflect on, and I'm kind of it wouldn't even be fair to say a lay historian here.
Sure.
My primary work has been in psychology, but as I've studied it, one of the things to pay attention to over time is what is happening in the universities, because they do tend to be culture informers and culture trendsetters based on the fact that the professional class that tend to be the people who hold sway over culture.
Sure. Positions of authority.
Titans of industry, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They all had their beginnings typically in the academy. And if we go back to this rift between facts and values that I was talking about before, that people like Julie Rubin have examined at great detail. One of you look at epistemology, okay, that's the theory of what counts as knowledge. That's a good way to understand what epistemology is. And I was making the claim that there is a more integrated epistemology that we could call the unity of truth theory, right? In the latter part of the 1800s, moving into the 20th century. And one of the culprits in that was the drive to separate religious education from education itself. And one of the funny or kind of quirky or odd dynamics that led to this, it's not as pointed as what some people might think, it was denominational disputes over who had authority and what denominational theologies weren't willing to budge on in the Ivy League context. And the argument was being made that knowledge was hitting its head on a ceiling because of these denominational constraints. Okay, and we have to expand the view into the evangelical West because of the origins of so many of these Ivy League colleges, right? That they were essentially and almost to an institution. They were all Christian in ethos and in their origin story. It doesn't matter if you're looking at Harvard or any of the rest of them. You look at their school seals and you see, you see explicitly Christian language or reference to the authority of God, etc. And inside of these denominational disputes, what ends up happening is they say we have to make a separation here so that knowledge can be pursued on its own, unfettered, right? Not bogged down by all of this. And so what happens is there's the invention of the dormitory, where once a moral education was a compulsory part of a typical undergraduate course, okay? And your first class would be an ethics course, and you would be learning what was called moral philosophy. And actually that was how psychology was understood before the invention of, the modern therapist's office and the research psychologist, etc. The self was the target, and how to sanity and morality were viewed as very similar, or almost synonymous with one another, right? Yeah. To be an immoral person was thought to be reprehensible, and the focus there was on character. And so you take George Herbert Palmer's introductory ethics course at Harvard, and he has in mind, in the latter part of the 18th century, that these students are there to become better people. Okay? That's not a claim that any professor in an introductory undergraduate course could make in any university these days without getting fired. Because who are you to tell me what a good person is? And who is anybody to make that claim? It's each for their own in the modern West, in the buffered self. And so there was a synthesis to knowledge, but the dormitory answers one of these needs about denominational dispute. And the move there was to say, well, we're going to make moral education an extracurricular function, and we're going to farm that out into dormitory life. So you'll have groups there. You'll have, where's the chuckle coming from?
Oh man, what a failed experiment,
right, right.
If you think of...
Now the impetus for that, I resonate with, because how many church dialogues have you been a part of where people just couldn't get over a particular interpretation of theology that foreclosed them to any exploration of what knowledge might be on the other side of that?
Right.
Okay, so I can empathize with that being the need. And I imagine sometimes to myself, were I a participant member in the professorial class of the era, I would probably be arguing for something the same, not knowing.
Where fraternity can plug a gap in, the inability to resolve theological disputes.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Was this instigation of the dormitory.
That's right.
Yeah.
So more and more of the moral education and the moral responsibility for the self then becomes siloed into your experience outside of what you're learning in the academy. And we start to see a bifurcation occur. And then you have, and again, historians will think of this as butchery, but I'm just tracing it through my observed focuses and subjects of interest as it relates to the work that I've done, right? So I'm using that as a heavy qualification.
Psychologist's perspective.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you have the induction of Freud's corpus of thought into the West in the period surrounding the latter part of the First World War, Second World War. And at the resolution of those wars, these theories have taken hold with greater potency already in the West. And Freud's tripartite model, of the self, id, ego, and superego, one distinctive feature about it that is worth paying attention to is that my read of it is that it lacks transcendence. Freud's self is bound up within itself. Everything is either the non-conscious self, the subconscious, or it's the conscious self. But that self is not oriented to or subjected to a higher order of goods that has any kind of organization to it. And my read of Freud is that he was in fact opposed to that.
So if you think of an idea like the communion of saints or angels or things like
divine.
that, or the divine,
Yeah.
Those are not quickly or able to be integrated into a Freudian worldview of what it means to be human.
No.
So the idea that we subject ourselves to something that's outside of ourselves is you're saying that's this kind of break that happens.
That's where you begin to see it break down. And you have Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, seizing upon that as an opportunity.
Go back to breaking the tripartite self.
Id, ego, and superego.
And which you were about to say something about what's really particular for us to pay attention to. Like, what about those three? Or can you give a brief synopsis of those three?
Yeah, so in Freud's typology, the ego is like a mediator between the id, the base desires that we have, the primal interests that we have, what gets referred to as animal instinct, right? And this is the part of us that wants to eat whatever's in front of it. And the ego is this kind of conscious mediator between that id and then the superego. And the superego is the uber responsible components of the self, which in Freud's perspective may be overly associated with undue influence from significant others who have seeded ideas into the self that unduly govern the self and restrict the interests of the id unduly, according to Freud.
So he wants to free the id up a little bit.
Freud located genius in the id, and he also associated that with youth. And so this immediately begins to flip on its head the way that the Western self would uphold virtue. Hey, Freud inverts that. You have the extolling of the youthful desires in the individual, and you have the extolling of the appetites because that's the source of unbridled genius. Maybe you should have sexual exploits and explore the farthest reaches of that within yourself. Maybe you should pursue this appetite that you have and see what is there to be discovered in it, unbridled. Okay? And when you overlay that with the bourgeois movements that in many ways began the Enlightenment and the interests that you saw swollen into madness in aspects of the French Revolution, for example, and you take the professorial class that is now living inside of this bifurcation of facts and values, unmoored from what they now deem to be merely values, but used to be the underpinnings for meaning and purpose in all of human life. And you start getting the poetry of a Ginsberg, or the rantings of, a Marxist. there's nothing there to keep that in check. And there's nothing there that can summon responsible thought into that territory. So now the id becomes God in the modern West. And Freud's nephew, Bernays, Edward Bernays, helped industry to capitalize on that and to use the principles of psychology to throttle down on this movement that they knew that Madison Avenue could capitalize on. And not just Madison Avenue, every other major industry, if it was properly sold. And so now self-definition is marked by this quest to be youthful and to be distinct as an individual from the collective. And this becomes the kind of inverted virtue in the inverted modern quest of the buffered self.
So there's a lot that you just said. So I'm, trying to unpack that a little bit. So you have Bernays, who's coming around the end of World War II, and we've had this conversation before, so I'm recalling some of these things.
And just to kind of mark that for people, we hear the term propaganda bandied about every single day, multiply, in whatever direction you happen to be looking. Edward Bernays wrote the book Propaganda. And when you work that through, it's an examination. You could say that it's a treatise on manipulation.
Sure.
That's one way to think about it. Now, in the traditions that you and I come from, the tradition I come from and you come from says that manipulation is something that God hates. Okay? When Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes with a statement, don't swear either by heaven, for it's his throne, or by earth because it's his footstool. Instead, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything beyond this is of evil. Okay? Of evil. Well, why would that be? I think it's because Christ so prizes you that he would sooner die, literally, than see one of his precious ones manipulated into a territory or a mode of thought that they didn't come to honestly. Manipulation is evil.
Yeah.
And Bernays came in, and he's just one. It's like, saddling,
an icon
it's like
for this
saddling
conversation,
Nietzsche
sure.
with all of the philosophical woes of the modern West.
Yeah.
But Bernays was very pointed in this. And everything from planned obsolescence in material industries to the marketing tactics used to sell people things they don't need and shouldn't purchase, okay, is all predicated on that kind of manipulation. And in my view of what counts as knowledge, that's dead wrong. Okay? People are worth so much more than that. And they're owed our honest engagement with them. But we have a culture that's built on dishonest engagement. And that was set into motion with a different kind of potency in the era that we're referring to. And leaving that unexamined, I would argue, is a recipe for ultimate disaster. And with that unexamined, industries do swell thoughtlessly into madness. And there's hardly an industry that you can look at, my own, of psychology in particular, without being brought to tears at the caustic effects that it's had in culture. Because when you lose what get called values, by what are you going to guide the self, and into what are you going to guide the self? What you're left to do if you're a practitioner of psychology, it becomes this pain mitigation effort. What are your symptoms? How can we reduce them? What do you feel badly about? How can we make you feel better? That's really all you've got to go on. And so when I was practicing, I studied these things deeply because I love the people that I work with, Right? I love my neighbors, and I endeavor to do so pointedly and intentionally. Right now, you're my neighbor and all these wonderful people here, and they're owed my attention, right? And they're owed my quest to speak truthfully and to take them in a spirit of common interest. And we have lost that as a culture, almost entirely. And so the focus that I tried to maintain in my work with people was to gently, sometimes potently, but whatever the situation required, to guide and invite focus back in these directions. Once you clear the territory after the presenting problem, whatever somebody walks in with, a major trauma in their lives, we got to attend to that. But we're far better off if we attend to that inside of a larger view of the world and
Sure.
the way that this individual is situated.
And a more coherent worldview.
100%.
So what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but therapy is a place where worldviews tend to have broken, or have the clothing of a worldview tends to tear, and then we say, I'm naked, and I'm, and I don't know how to put my life back together because the underpinnings of what I've used to put my life together in the first place is not a cohesive or coherent worldview that I can trust to put my life on. Or so I'm in the pursuit of knowledge goodness, and what I'm living right now is not good. And so they end up in your office in some way with, I don't know how to put my life back together again. And yes, there's what I hear you saying is we have to attend to the care that somebody needs when they've experienced a trauma or massive life-changing event,
or
grief, or all sorts of stuff like that. But the long-term benefit of that person, once that immediate thing is addressed, and sometimes that takes a while, but is actually, how do we coherently decide on how we want to live our lives?
Yeah.
So that's where you're.
Who and what am I as a human being?
And how am I made, and how do I actually function?
What is the nature of the universe that I inhabit?
Yeah.
And how can my humanity best flourish or thrive in that setting, properly understood? But the beautiful articulation you just gave about therapy and what may have gone on in my office does not square with the way that therapy is cast from the academy onward in the modern West. And what you will hear more of right there in the text is a real emphasis on the client being the expert in their own experience. Okay? And that proves in almost every case not to be true.
Right.
Especially if it's an unexamined life.
Because if I knew how to put my life together, why am I experiencing the things I'm experiencing?
That's right.
So
now, leaving aside what we already said, that life is brutal and we're going to run into trauma, right? And whether it's family of origin stuff, that isn't merely the product of worldview. Sometimes life comes and gives you a shitty deal. And that's the case for most people. They're gonna contend with something that overpowers them and brings them near to what they feel like might be the end of their days. We're talking about the bowels of life experience. And so I want to give a fair accounting of that and be generous and kind and gentle with people in that territory.
And in some degree, my sin and sin enacted upon me can break worldview as well in what I believe to be true.
That's right.
About myself and others and God and all those kinds of things. So, and
that can become layered into a multi-generational dynamic that is quite entwined, right?
Right.
But I'm wanting to name that therapy itself is actually a disparate representation of the broader culture. There is no guiding central principle in the therapies that are practiced. And I have a lot of wonderful colleagues that have hearts and minds that I would aspire to having, that are out there just grinding it out, doing their very best for the people that they serve. And so that's not a knock on any of them or any of the people I don't know in the profession who have that same quest in their bellies and in their chest. That notwithstanding, the industry, as I understand it and have experienced it, is an incoherent mess.
Right.
As it regards worldview, as it regards what it deems to be its central purposes, I don't think it could. There's no unified voice out of which that is spoken any longer. And so what you end up having is one theory after another.
Sure. Right?
And these are the very often and most often well-meaning attempt of somebody to address a problem that they wanted to reduce suffering in. And more power to you, fill your boots. I'm very thankful that EMDR has been developed. I'm very thankful that various family systems theories are there to articulate and translate our experiences to us. But without a guiding principle and without a claim on what a human being is, it's hard to move forward into something that looks like a coherent life quest, right? The client is left to their own in that department. And so I think that any psychology practiced without a coherent understanding of what it means to have a fine character and to cite that as your aim is an irresponsible psychology.
Sure.
And I think vocational principles provide us an anchor inside of that journey that allow for an arrangement of whatever theories are most applicable into that life. But without a vocational focus, without a sense of calling and response in that individual's life.
So in some sense, there's these, what it is to be human is beautifully constrained in a way that we can't ignore.
Yes.
And so we have a way to approach people. If it's unconstrained, it's actually not helpful. And on the other end of it, we have individuals who are also beautifully specific.
That's right.
If that makes sense. And there's a tension between I can't dictate what's good for me in my life in certain aspects being good for you in your, I might need to go for a run and you might need to go meditate.
Right.
Based on how God has made us individually. And meditation might be good for everyone. Right.
That's personality.
So
it's what you come out of the womb with.
Yeah. And I know you and I have had, other conversations about why that's near and dear to both you and I, because it comes into identity and things like that.
Yes.
So there is a beautiful, loving somebody well is actually finding themselves within a coherent worldview, but the particularity of that individual as well.
That's right. Yeah, that's where the distinction between personality and character is so important.
Right.
You're a father. Mm-hmm. I'm a father. A lot of the people listening will have had children of their own and known from the outset the distinction that marked each of their children. And that was pre-conscious, right? You see the features of personality in an infant I would argue that you can see the features of personality and perceive them in utero.
Sure. I would say I've experiences of that with my kids.
Yeah, when Candy was pregnant with R3, one of the little games that we would play is around month 5 or 6, I would put my ear to her belly and I would try and find that heartbeat. And I would find it. And then I would tap on her belly so that she could feel and resonate with the cadence of that heartbeat. It was just a beautiful little game. It's a way for a father to be involved, because at that point you're just kind of biding time and trying to support as best as you can, but you don't have a physical experience of this mystery that's unfolding, right? And so nightly we would do this. And you spend enough time with your ear to that little being right on the other side of that little barrier, and you start noticing differences, especially when you have your second child. And Noah was in there just having a party, and he still loves a party. And Sophia was in there just kind of moving through the motions with a flow, still, calm. You just had a sense of this at ease presence. And then Georgia, a human firecracker, right? I got kicked in the face by her when I was trying to find the heartbeat. And metaphorically, I still get kicked in the face by Georgia, That's personality. Yeah. And that's not going to change. And that's, my statement that you're God's good idea, that Kevin is God's good idea. The personality is that infinite opportunity for God to express and to reveal his nature and character in all of us as ourselves, as distinct reflections of as fractal reflections of the infinite God, as good. Okay? Character is what we've got to do with that personality. It's the habits that are taken on into that self. Yeah. And it is the verdict about whether or not that self is a virtuous individual or becomes a virtuous individual.
To the degree of which they actually have self-possession the personality that they have, so that they can rule themselves appropriately to bring to bear the good idea actually manifests in kingdom building. Yeah. In a kingdom building reality.
And the culmination of all of that, what I would argue is one of the central interests of Christ, is, and what we haven't focused enough, I don't think, on in our churches, in the corporate settings that we're all in. We've quested after this almost detached notion of holiness, which becomes performative. But to teach at depth how to form character is a different deal. And what Christ gets in the end bargain is the person that we become, right? And that's one way to spell out what life is all about. It's becoming yourself and submitting yourself to that which is good as your highest aim. And then presenting that self as an offering to the world, to bless the world by. And that's what we're trying to teach our children, and that's what whether I was intimating that in therapy or whether I was hitting that right on the nose with people, and it was everything in between. But that was my guiding interest. And that isn't, in my observation, that's not the guiding interest of a lot of therapists. And a lot of therapists would have a real contention with a lot of what I'm saying right now. And I'd be totally open to dialogue with them on those fronts. Yeah.